Let us begin. Hello and welcome to the webinar, Changes in Brain Function and Structure with Trauma. And I'll just introduce myself and then Rosemary. My name is Judith Richards. I'm the creator of the Richards Trauma Process. The Richards Trauma Process resolves trauma generally in 3 to 4 sessions. And that was developed by me just out of absolute need. I had a ridiculous life with lots and lots of trauma. So that resulted in me having extreme PTSD and all sorts of other complications, mental health complications, as well as physical trauma. And I had to get well and get family members well that had been through it with me. So thus we have TRTP. We have now taught over 300 mental health and health professionals around Australia and elsewhere. We have amongst our graduate community, doctors, anaesthetists, mental health social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, etc. And I would love to introduce to you Rosemary, who came on a few years ago. I've been teaching it for 5 years, nearly 6 years now, and Rosemary was in one of the early cohorts, and we were blessed to have her join us at that time. Hi, Rosemary.
Hi, Judith. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And Rosemary is in Sydney. I'm in Queensland. Rosemary is a child development and education psychologist, so background, as well as she's done massive studies in neurology and nutrition. And she is a leader in neurofeedback. Would you like to tell us a little more about yourself, Rosemary?
I work a lot with children and adults who are traumatized, ADD, Asperger's, autistic, learning difficulties, depression, anxiety. And I use a myriad of treatment interventions: neurofeedback, hypnosis, the trauma process, sound therapy, all in an effort to get that brain, to nurse that brain back to health.
Right.
And I'll do whatever I need to get it back to where it needs to be, as much as I can.
To unfreeze it.
Absolutely.
Yes. And so what we're going to do today with Rosemary is we're going to have a look at the differences between a normal brain and a traumatized brain. Because you were telling me, Rosemary, that there are predictable changes in both structure and function of the brain. Is that correct?
Yep. And that's seen on MRI scans, it's seen on SPECT scans and PET scans. And the 3 most important networks that are affected in trauma or PTSD, developmental trauma, are your default mode network, your salience network, and your executive, central executive network.
And I'm going to bring up a slide. So we'll just stop there, Rosemary, while I go to the slide. And if people could just put in the chat if they can see the slide. That's great. Okay.
All right. So
off we go.
The default mode network, I guess, is probably the most important network for everybody. It's the one that is the most dysregulated in any psychiatric condition, but particularly in PTSD or trauma or developmental trauma. And the default mode network has midline structures, lateral and parietal lobes. It's to do with self-regulation, reflection, emotional regulation, social cognition, autobiographical memory, and future-oriented thinking. It's the network that says, if I do this, this will happen. It plans for the future. It reflects on your past actions. Of course, you know that in PTSD and in trauma, none of that happens. You can't reflect as to what you've just done because your brain gets hijacked and the amygdala gets hijacked.
Yes, and I call it craft. Can't remember a flipping thing. Just
there you go.
Doesn't work. Doesn't work.
Not at all. There are parts that get totally, once your default mode network is offline or dysregulated, it's very difficult to run simulations of what could happen and to reflect upon what has happened. Then we come to our salience
Can I just stop you there, Rosemary, because in a little while you're going to go into why there's that fractured memory that happens. It's fragmented. You know, putting things in a linear timeline is very, very difficult, particularly.
Very difficult with when you're in trauma.
Yeah, yeah. And there's reasons and there's changes in the brain. It's fascinating. So I'll let you carry on now.
The salience network, the one in the middle, you can see your anterior cingulate cortex, which is your frontal. You've got your frontal insula. The insula is very important in trauma. The detection of personality, internal and external stimuli. The salience network directs behavior to maintain homeostasis. And homeostasis is what can't be maintained in trauma. And in PTSD, we know that we have an altered arousal and we have problems with interoception. Then we come to our central
just
executive.
Going back to that, an altered arousal and does that have anything to do with the startle reflex at all?
With the Moro reflex, absolutely. The Moro reflex, which is the reflex that we're all born with, ends up becoming, as we get older and we normalize, becomes an adult startle reflex. But once you end up in trauma, that reflex is back again.
Yes, and when I was little, I had a lot of early childhood trauma, and one of the local kids' games was to just come up and go boo behind me, and I would fall down.
Absolutely.
That vagus nerve would hit in and my legs would be taken from out of me, and often I'd faint.
Syncope is very common.
Yeah.
Fainting is very common in trauma. Very.
Yes. Had lots of clients with that issue.
And the central executive network is your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex up the front, which is absolutely crucial for working memory. This is why your memory...
Except when it's not working.
Exactly. And it can't work if the executive network is not online properly. Then you've got, and your executive function is for cognitive control of thought and emotion and behavior. So if it's not going to work, if it's not going to tell you, hang on a minute, that shot was, that was the backfiring of a car, it wasn't, an explosion of a gun or an IED, then you have no idea. And you just get hijacked.
There's no regulating it at all. No logic to kick in, because we go straight into the subconscious where logic doesn't exist, and we are there and I am not safe. Our whole being screams, I'm not safe.
And there's no distinction between then and now.
None at all.
That doesn't happen, particularly when you've got veterans coming back from war zones or medics or people that have been in traumatic situations. They cannot do it.
There's no difference at all between what was happening then and now. We are still, it's like there's a videotape loop in the subconscious, and our subconscious runs every chemical reaction, every electrical response in our body, and it's like, it's happening now, it's happening now, it's happening now, it's happening now. And so domestic violence, childhood abuse, even though I'm 53, that priest is doing that to me now.
Exactly. Yep.
And it's not comfortable.
Look, the central executive network is responsible for the control of attention, for effort, for the inhibition of task irrelevant behavior. And if it's not online, as it isn't in trauma, it can't do any of that. It can't say, hang on, that's irrelevant. It was happening then. And that's its job.
And you can't get anything done.
Nothing. You're preoccupied with it, and it takes a very long time to come back to that pre-startle. Does that make sense?
Yes. And we've seen extraordinary things happen with TRTP where people come back immediately.
Yep. The saliency network, let's go back to that one.
Sure.
It's the automatic detection of things that have meaning in terms of visual stimuli, somatosensory targets, and it's really, really fast at fast error awareness and correction. But when it isn't online, you end up ruminating, somatic, vertic, introspective, wandering targets, and you're all over the place. You're all over the shop. You can't stay on topic in a conversation. You're tangential. You misinterpret questions.
Okay, tangential. Can you please explain tangential?
Tangential. You go off on a tangent. You can't stay on the topic.
No. It's like a pinball machine.
Exactly. One thought leads to another and off you go. Never mind that it's not relevant to what you're talking about.
And it can be very embarrassing.
Oh, absolutely. Especially when you, if with your family, it's not so bad, but with others, it becomes particularly embarrassing. Your default mode network, on the other hand, encodes all of your sensory information and gives you that ability to reflect. When you've been traumatized, you don't have that ability to reflect on your actions or what's just happened. So you end up with that storytelling, but the storytelling is skewed.
Yeah.
It's absolutely skewed. It's nothing like the story was.
And that's the thing.
It's
the memory shifts, and the memory changes.
Yep.
And it's not that someone's making things up.
Nope.
It's not that they're doing it consciously.
Not at all.
But it's just something that happens. There's some questions here. I'm just trying to access them here. Just a second. There was a question about does the salience network involve the emotional system?
The salience network?
Yeah.
Well, it does in terms of the insula, yes, because the insula is there to dampen it down.
To dampen it down, to regulate it and go,
when it works properly, yes.
But when it doesn't work, we don't even know we're over the top.
Exactly. So in that way, it is connected.
And there's lots of over the topness. I think that's a technical term with PTSD.
We'll work with that.
Yeah. So someone's saying, Annette, somebody can't get in to the webinar. I suggest that they go out and try to get in again, and that they do put in their password. I think this was password regulated, but I'm just carrying on from there. Sorry to interrupt, Rosemary.
It's okay, that's fine. If you want to go to the brain circuitry involved in PTSD, that might be a good one to go to next.
Is that the one?
No.
That one. Here we go.
That's the one. Yep.
That's the one. And I'll just make it a bit smaller so it fits on screen better.
Yep.
There we go. Whoa. Beautiful. Sorry, people. Just bear with me.
Just a little bit more if you can. Beautiful. Okay.
There we go. There we go.
This will probably put all of those parts of the default mode network and the salience and the central executive network into context. Your central motor strip right across from the temporal lobe from one side to the other across the brain, your sensory motor cortex, coordinates sensory and motor information. In PTSD, it results in increased activation so that you can't settle. You are hypersensitive to things. So sounds are louder, movements are exaggerated. A look becomes a stare, becomes a death threat. It takes on a life of its own in PTSD. Yeah. She looked at me the wrong way. Whoa, what are you looking at me like that for? They're the sorts of comments.
And that can be dangerous on public transport with someone who's got PTSD, another person on the train, and you just happen to glance over. What are you looking at? And that, woof, it can set off. And even the breeze in the tree.
Correct.
It's just such a startle response. So there's this much stressor and that much stress response.
And what happens in the brain is that the reactive threshold, the threshold for neuron firing, has been decreased to the point where it doesn't take much to get an over-exaggerated response. So your threshold, the neuronal threshold for firing in a PTSD brain, has been lowered to the point where it's almost like having a seizure. It's like your seizure threshold, your response threshold, your neuronal microvolt resting threshold has been decreased so that not just one neuron fires, a whole row fires. And then before you know it, everything's blown out of proportion.
Absolutely. There is no moderation, and it's like a hair trigger. And as people go on and on for years with PTSD, that trigger gets faster and faster and bigger unless there is an effective intervention to turn it all off.
You really need to bring that parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system into balance. And until that happens with somatic work, with the Richards trauma process, with neurofeedback, whatever tools you have at your disposal, until you don't reset the brain, in other words, reboot it, it's not going to happen. And it takes lots of interventions for different people. Some it's really easy, and for others you just have to work a bit harder.
And this is Ali Murray says, so this is why people with PTSD can appear hot and cold. Yes, and we will be going into, Ali, we will be going into the hyper and the hypo, and what happens when there's fight and flight, certainly, it's a hyper aroused state of anxiety, etc. But then there's freeze, which is the shutdown state of depression. And the
freeze, that freeze is actually your reptilian brain, the periaqueductal gray and the superior colliculus. That's your reptilian brain that literally freezes you.
Yes.
And it has a direct link to the thalamus and to the amygdala.
Yes. And the
amygdala is fight and flight. Yep, let's go. Yep. And the reptilian brain is, I can't move. I'm paralyzed with fear.
No, I call it the impala response.
There you go.
When a lion grabs, caught in the headlight, when a lion grabs an impala, or the rabbit's in the headlights, and the impala doesn't pretend to be dead, playing possum. It just, the vagus steps in, everything, the heart rate goes down, respiration, everything just goes right down to slow. And it can take your legs out from under you. It's basically the body getting ready to die.
Correct. Yep.
Carry on, Rosemary.
In PTSD, your thalamus, which I call Grand Central Station, because it gets all the information from the body, has to go through the thalamus before the thalamus distributes it to the cortex. And then the cortex decides, particularly the frontal lobes, decides what reaction is going to happen.
And is the thalamus a part of the limbic system?
The thalamus is your central relay system.
Right.
It's right there in the middle of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
It distributes everything.
Mm-hmm.
And in PTSD, because it has decreased cerebral blood flow, in a PTSD brain, you can actually see that when you do HEG studies and when you do SPECT scans. You find that in PTSD, because you've got that decreased blood flow, the thalamus can't work properly, which means information is distorted. So the frontal lobes say, well, what do you want me to do? I can't make sense of what you've given me. And therefore you have a muted or an attenuated frontal lobe response in PTSD. There is no inhibitory. The prefrontal cortex and your frontal cortex is there to inhibit your fear circuitry. But if it's not getting enough information about what it's supposed to be inhibiting, then nothing much happens.
Yeah, and even reading is, I used
Absolutely.
to find I would, because I'm an avid reader, and I would read a sentence and have to read it again and again and again, and the information would just not go in.
Yep. Then we come to your parahippocampal gyrus. That's usually responsible for memory, for encoding, memory encoding and retrieval of information. But in PTSD, it shows a stronger connectivity with the medial prefrontal cortex and a decrease in volume. So because it's decreased in volume, it's not doing its job either. Retrieval is much more difficult. Yeah?
Yeah.
Then we've got your fear response, that good old Moro reflex, that adult startle reflex, which is an evolution. We're all born with it, right?
Yes.
We have to have it. But that response becomes far more sensitive to stress than it's ever been. And then you end up with this generalized, anxiety, this fear response. And it's very difficult to extinguish. It's very difficult to extinguish this fear response once it's been heightened to the point as it is in PTSD or trauma or even developmental trauma. And by the way, there's lots of information to say that if a person has been brought up with developmental trauma, their hair trigger for any further trauma is so heightened that these are the ones that are more likely to witness PTSD later in life, because their whole body has been primed for fear.
Yes, and there's been studies done on twins going to war, experiencing very similar situations, and one will come back with PTSD and one won't.
And the other one won't.
And it's because of earlier life trauma, not necessarily early life, but earlier, before being sent to war.
Correct.
There was trauma. And the way I look at it is that those videotape loops we spoke about that have not been stored properly in memory. The event is over and memory is supposed to put it in the warehouse of memory, and shut the door, the hippocampus and the other bits involved in putting that in the warehouse of memory, shut the door, and that's over. But what happens instead is it gets stored like in the subconscious, a videotape loop. It's happening now, it's happening now. And the way I look at it is it's like the pressure in a balloon. There's when I was 3 and when I was 7, when I was 16, and these videos,
and
this distress builds up and builds up and builds up until it blows out, because it has to blow out. It blows out into anxiety, into depression, into OCD, into hoarding, into addiction, into PTSD, into eating disorders, into physical illness, into chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, lupus. And so what TRTP does is it turns off those videotape loops, and you're talking about the soldier, you know, somebody going to war. And I've worked with many, and one of our teaching team now, Steve Gardner, and you can see his interview and a webinar I did with Steve and with a lovely commando veteran. Steve was ex-SAS. He was conscripted in the SAS in Zimbabwe back in the Rhodesian War. And when I met him in his, he would have been, I don't know, he was about 60. When I met him, he still had extreme PTSD, and we did TRTP, and he went straight from my rooms to the cinema to test it, because he's a scientist, to test if it had worked. And he went straight to the film that had just been released, Saving Private Ryan, which is supposed to be the most realistic war film ever created. And so he went, and he was waiting for the huge triggers, and nothing happened. And he walked out of the cinema, thought that can't be right. Yeah. So he bought another ticket and walked back in and watched it again, and came out chuckling. No triggers. He went home, slept like a baby. He sent me a text. This shit works. Yeah. And that is typical of what happens with the TRTP. Anyway, you can go and watch that on YouTube, TRTP, which is Trauma Process channel, with Steve Gardner and lovely Tim Thomas, who's a younger commando, Afghanistan War.
Yeah.
So moving right along.
Okay, we come to the hippocampus. That's the one that stores, it becomes a conditioned fear response, associative learning. This happened, therefore I'm going to end up feeling like this. So you condition that fear response. And in PTSD and trauma, you end up with an increased responsiveness to traumatic and emotional stimuli.
And it's everywhere.
It's everywhere. It floods your entire thing.
Everything begins to be associated with the fear.
With that fear.
Everything.
And it could even be stimuli that were not associated in the first place. So unrelated stimuli will now be linked
to do with it.
Yep.
And that brings us to that, once again, you can't escape a danger that's everywhere.
Yep.
So there's no respite.
And see, the amygdala, unlike the hippocampus, the amygdala is not, it ends up in trauma, the amygdala ends up in a very negative plastic change. Once you trigger that amygdala, it's one-time learning. And once that fear is there and the amygdala is triggered, it is almost impossible with talk therapy to untrigger it. It doesn't take in new information. You can modify your hippocampus. You can grow new dendrites in your hippocampus. You can create new memories. But the amygdala goes into a negative plastic change. It's stuck. And it's kind of like, the amygdala is kind of like a smoke detector, right? The input coming. Is it survival? Quick, how fast do I do it? It's unconscious, it's automatic, and with the help of the hippocampus, you get this memory that is set for life. And that's when you have this negative rumination, this loop. And under threat, the signal goes to the hypothalamus, to the brainstem, to the autonomic nervous system, and your whole body, and you have that fabulous amygdala hijack. It hijacks everything. It takes your frontal lobes offline, it takes your salience offline, it's all gone. Once that amygdala is triggered, you have to finish off the response.
And it takes your gut offline. Everything that's not needed for absolute survival, it shuts down, because you don't need to do maths running away from a tiger. You don't need to digest breakfast running away from a tiger. The problem is that within PTSD, it's 24/7. Exactly. And it's a spectrum. There's mild PTSD and there's extreme PTSD.
Yep. And if you think of the thalamus as the cook within the brain, the thalamus integrates all of your perceptions into a coherent experience of this is what is happening to me. And it sends it via extremely fast fibers, the fast low road to the amygdala, or the slow or high road to the frontal cortex, depending upon how well your thalamus is working as to where it will go. And if the thalamus is compromised, as it is in PTSD, the time freezes and an event goes on forever. It's like you're in the zone of negativity, if you like. Time freezes, and if it's never going to come to an end.
Yeah.
Your prefrontal cortex, on the other hand, is the watchtower. It observes, it inhibits, it organizes, and it modulates the hardwired reactions and pre-programmed into the emotional brain. But in PTSD, the decrease in the white matter density and the decrease of responsiveness prolongs the trauma and increases the severity of the trauma.
Okay, can I stop you there? Because
Sure.
On another conversation, you're saying that with extreme trauma, the white matter and grey matter actually decreases. There is less of it. There is less.
That's right. Grey and white matter, the density decreases. In other words, there is almost a neuronal death. Yeah, the grey matter is your cell body, and the white matter are your dendrites.
Mm-hmm.
So in trauma, it's as if those parts of the brain almost die.
Yep.
Does that make sense? You just lose volume.
Yeah. Yep. And there's volume change in a number of areas in the brain.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And we'll go into that in more detail.
Volume changes in your anterior cingulate cortex, right up the front, for cognition, for inhibition of motor activity. It quietens restlessness. It's an autonomic function, right? Cognition. But that too has a lower volume and a higher resting state. So it doesn't take much again to trigger it.
And there's no calm. There is no respite.
There's no respite. It's
the whole
24/7.
being, the whole body is in hyperarousal. Where's the danger? 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 All the time. It's where's the danger?
And there's a lot of evidence, especially when I collect EEGs of the brain. The first thing I'll ask is, have you had a head injury? If they can't settle because they're restless. There's this tremor, this imperceptible tremor that they're not even aware of. And my next question is, if you haven't had a head injury per se, having had a physical hit on the head, then have you experienced trauma? And in fact, what we're learning now is that developmental trauma is in fact brain damage. Developmental trauma leads to brain damage because the brain is totally changed because of that trauma. So that's what the new research is suggesting now. And that sets us up for PTSD as adults.
Yeah. Okay. And yes, it does. And so there's a question from Anusha. Do you have the research reference for this, or is it all in Mayan and Ressia 2012?
There's a lot of that in there already. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I'll see if I can dig up another reference. I was just looking at it. I just can't remember right now.
No, that's okay. And Raywin Proctor is saying, are you saying the amygdala can't be repaired after trauma?
That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the plastic change that happens to the amygdala will not be changed just with talk therapy alone, or
because
just with medication alone. It can't be.
Because with talk therapy, it teaches understanding of what's going on.
But understanding doesn't the amygdala at all. It doesn't even come close to touching it.
Yep.
Doesn't.
Because
the amygdala is one-time learning, and it's that negative plastic change. It can't even touch it, can't come close.
Okay. And Fran is asking, does post-TRTP, does the white and grey matter increase? Fran, we are looking forward to the time when we have enough money to do MRIs, etc., to show the changes in structure. Yeah. But in the meantime, the EEGs that Rosemary does, you can absolutely see the change in function.
What we do know, what I do see with my neurofeedback, because I've got post and pre and post, is that
we're going to do one. I'm going to show you. Yes, I'm going to show you one of Rosemary's scans on a client, on a lovely man. And Nora, are these damages reversible? Yes.
Yes, of course they are.
Yes. The brain is plastic.
But not with talk therapy and medication. That does not touch it, unfortunately. No. Which is why they're on medication for years. And forever. At the age of 60, they've still got PTSD, and it was when they were 20. So what we've done before does not work.
It doesn't work. That's why we have to do something different.
That's why we have the suicide rate that we do in veterans.
And even more so in their children, just saying.
Oh, definitely in their children.
Yeah. So.
Okay, so can we now go to that slide number 3 that we've got up there?
Yes.
Please.
That's slide number 3. 1, 2, 3, which is actually number 4.
Which is
no problem.
that one, not that one.
What about not that one?
No, the one one before that. There we go. Yep. Normal information processing.
Okay. And there's a question from Anusha. What about the physiological something of ADHD in adults with developmental trauma in childhood?
What about
this is in reference to the restlessness Rosemary was speaking about.
All of that is connected with that sensory motor strip, with the amygdala, with the hippocampus, with the salience. It's all connected. An ADHD brain, in my
very
view,
similar,
is a traumatized brain.
That is it.
View.
And I had a doctor who was had been researching ADHD for years, and he rang me up a little while ago and said, I've just finally realized that ADHD is actually PTSD. It's trauma.
It's trauma.
I said, well, hello, it's all the same symptoms. It's
just on the spectrum. It's about, it's a matter of degree, severity. Okay, just very quickly, because I know we've got to get on with it. Okay, the prefrontal cortex in a normal brain is responsible for complex thinking, decision-making, and appropriate behavior. In a PTSD brain, however, that is so dysfunctional that thought processing and decision-making is just taken offline. That's why these people have such a difficult time making up their mind. Shall I go out or shall I stay in? What shall I have for dinner? They procrastinate. They procrastinate because that prefrontal cortex cannot make decisions. Yep. Have you noticed that, Judith?
Oh, yes. And there's a fear. The fear kicks in as well. What if I make the wrong decision?
Exactly. What happens if I do this? Because you see, the default mode network is offline, so they can't run simulations about what if. And that's what your default network is about. Your default mode network is they run simulations about past, what happened in the past, and the future. So I did that, and this is what happened. So if I do this, what will happen now? But because the default mode network is dysfunctional, the prefrontal cortex can't make a decision, and they're terrified of making the wrong one. Okay, then you've got the hippocampus, transfers and stores information. In an OCD brain, stores memories incorrectly. The OCD brain is also very similar to a traumatized brain, which is why trauma people hoard. Oh, I've got to hang on to this. Yep.
Yeah, and the OCD with OCD is very resolvable with TRTP.
And then your hypothalamus, we've already done that. I just wanted you to have a quick look at that. Hormone levels overreact. We'll talk about hormones, we'll talk about neurotransmitters in a minute to show you that at the biochemical level, when I send them for biochemical testing with my GP, the hormones are all over the place and their biochemistry is not working. Their serotonin, their dopamine, their GABA, particularly those that have rage, have high copper, low zinc, and very little GABA. And GABA, we know, is our major inhibitory neurotransmitter. The amygdala, again, sets the fight or flight. Okay, now we can go to the one with the serotonin and your neurotransmitters.
What color is that?
That's the one underneath, second, third, fourth slide is what I've got here.
Not that one?
The one above that. No, one above that one. Okay. So we're talking about neurotransmitters. Okay. So we all know that in PTSD, it's a well-researched fact that there are decreased levels of serotonin. Serotonin is your happy, your rest, relax, sleep, happy hormone. Yep. And that's disturbed because the relationship between your amygdala and your hippocampus is not right. That dynamic relationship has been mucked up, and therefore the serotonin cannot reduce the anxiety like it's supposed to. Instead, you have what we call a hyper-serotonin syndrome, which is vigilance, impulsivity, intrusive memories. So you can have a deficit in serotonin, which is sadness, but you can have hyper-serotonin, which is vigilance and always on guard. They can never rest. They can never settle. Their eyes dart around the room. They can't settle. They'll walk up and down. They'll pace instead of sitting down and having a conversation with you. Instead of looking at your face, they're looking all over the room. Yep. Mm-hmm. If you have, on the other hand, you've got norepinephrine, you've got corticotrophin, they have increased activity. But that Exactly.
Shuts things down.
And that allows them to dissociate. Numbing, and that's when you get that numbing experience. I don't feel anything. I'm not even mad at him for abusing me because, well, I just don't feel anything. It's as if I wasn't there. And that's when dissociation happens. So norepinephrine, as well as, or noradrenaline, as well as dopamine, are responsible for the physiological effects of PTSD, increased blood pressure, pulse, startle response, and increased levels. When you have lots of norepinephrine, you're highly anxious because you're on that high level of stress. Yep. So you've got effect on fear conditioning, comprehension of and response to fear memories related to fear. So they're not understanding why they've reacted this way. Why did I get so upset? Why was I triggered? So
why was I so over the top?
Over the top reactions. Yep. So there's your neurotransmitters.
And so does that have something to do with the rage?
Absolutely. This incredible rage. If you've got norepinephrine coursing through your system, you've got corticotrophins. My goodness, there's no way you can control that. If you haven't got enough GABA, if one of your neurotransmitters is up and you're not producing enough GABA, you can't shut it down because GABA is your inhibitory neurotransmitter. And the people with rage have high copper, low GABA, high norepinephrine, low dopamine. Okay, that's your profile.
Yeah, and just for those who work with people with anger management, there's two different types of anger. There's the slow burn of resentment and irritation and frustration, and then there's the anger of trauma. And the anger of trauma is 0 to 1,000 miles an hour in a nanosecond. It's like a lit match. Yep. It's like a lit match at petrol, and it is completely unconscious, and there is no way to stop it. It's just bang, like a nuclear explosion. And so to teach these people, just notice that you're starting to sweat, that you're starting to clench your fist. There's none of that. I used to be driving along and fine, and then screaming at the top of my voice. I was just bang. So in order to stop that rage, you have to turn off those videotape loops, which is what we do with TRTP.
Yep. Okay, let's go to, let's have a look. We'll go on to impact of trauma on the amygdala. I think we've probably covered that.
I think we have.
Yeah, let's go to the brain areas relevant. We'll just have a quick look if there's any questions.
Is great.
I'm just going to.
This is great. I love this one.
This I just put as a summary for people that might like to have boxes and summaries. So the reduced changes, reduced volume and plasticity in the hippocampus. So it's difficult to make new memories. New memories can be made, but talk therapy to try and make new memories is very difficult to do once you're in trauma. And what happens is that you cannot stop that stress response. You can't even verbalize it. You can't even find the words. So your word finding ability, your verbal memory, your ability to extinguish that fear, to discriminate between safe and unsafe is just shot to pieces. You don't know what's real anymore. Is this a real threat, suspected threat, a past threat, a future one? All that ability to make those decisions is taken offline. Your amygdala, we don't know, we can't see any structural evidence, but we do know that there's an increased reactivity on SPECT scans, on EEG, on MRIs. Hyper-responsiveness, but also to neutral stimuli such as faces. He just looked at me, and that's enough to set them off.
Yeah.
The medial prefrontal cortex, decreased volume. The anterior cingulate, the orbital frontal cortex, correlated with severity of symptoms. So the more offline they are, the more severe and the more reactive those symptoms are going to be. Yeah. And you see your medial frontal cortex is very inhibitory. It puts down, it stops your fear circuitry from running away from you. If it's got a decreased volume, if it's not working.
No brakes.
No brakes.
No brakes.
Can't put the brakes on. There are no brakes to be had. And that's when people feel numb. They just go from, I don't know what made me do it. When you ask them what happened, they say, I don't know. And they honestly don't know. The anterior cingulate is under functioning. That's a decrease in body awareness and body integration. This is why Van der Kolk comes along
Association.
and says, yep, he comes along and says the body keeps the score. If you can't release it from the body, which we can do very well with TRTP, to release it from that, it's almost in their DNA. It's in every cellular memory. It's in that cellular memory. So trauma is stored there. So that we've got to find a way to release it. And then, of course, your sensory motor cortex, no clear evidence for structural alterations, but increased reactivity, again seen on SPECT, EEG, and MRIs.
Yeah.
And of course, we know that it's hyperaroused when it gets triggered by a stimulus.
Yes. And that brings us to a question by Anusha, that with dissociation, do brain scans show activation in brain areas, but just less conscious awareness of thoughts, emotion, etc.? Or is there actually less activity?
It can be either too much or not enough.
Hyper or hypo?
Hypoarousal is just as bad as hyperarousal.
It's the fight and flight or the freeze.
Or the freeze. Yep. It depends on what, on memory is a state trait, right? It depends what the state was when the memory was made as to what you will see in your brain scans, whether you'll see a hypoarousal or a hyper.
And Rosemary, can we at this point go to the scan that you did?
Sure, you can bring it up.
So just a second, I'll come back here and go to share screen again. Carlo Jacobs Bloom, do you have a perspective on EMDR re-altering the trauma brain? Yes, in February, there was a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma in the training, and he used so much EMDR, and he said with extreme complex trauma, it would often take 9 years to get someone ready to really do EMDR. So there are issues with that, and here we go. Can you see this? Rosemary, talk us through.
I can see this. Okay. So here was a guy who was sent to me by his entire family, his ex-wife and his 2 daughters, to say, go and get yourself fixed because we can't live with you anymore. We don't even want to see you till you go and do something. So he came all the way down from Mullumbimby, and he walked in the door. He said, I've been sent for you to fix my brain. And I thought, okay, hang on a second. I'll just get my magic wand out here and I'll just wave it over. You can go back in. Mm-hmm. And he thought that was rather funny. I mean, I was being facetious, of course, but having said that, there were so many issues that came up. Asperger's, very high functioning. TBI, many hits to the brain, many motor vehicle accidents, motorbike, falls off of motorbikes, riding horses, etc. A lot of early childhood PTSD, horrible relationship with his dad, emotionally distant mum, lots of anxiety, reactive attachment disorder, poor personal relationships. And as you can see here, can you go down for me just a little bit, Judith?
Sure.
Okay. All right.
And I'm just giving a proviso that we'll do this in about 5 minutes, right?
Yep, that's it. Okay. So you can see here on the left-hand side, there's your prefrontal cortex, absolutely red in all bands. So you know that it's not functioning. So that part, the anterior cingulate up the top in the middle, all of that part of the default mode network is not working. It's just too hot. There's too much arousal. It cannot inhibit. It cannot quench the fear circuitry. So we've got, and if you can see down here, an amplitude asymmetry from FP1, which is right, the top left. You've got all of those lines coming down. That is the part of the network that is not working properly. Incoherence, you've got hardly any connections going to where they should go, which means the timing, the connectivity, the communication between different brain sites and networks is not working. So he's totally disconnected from his body, and his brain is just running away and doing its own thing. Nobody can talk to him. He gets really angry. Next slide, Judith, because we've only got 5 minutes.
Yeah.
All right, so this is him after 3 sessions of TRTP. Not all of it is cleared up, but there's a huge difference. We've only got the remnants of ADHD to clear up here with the theta activity in the frontal lobes. We've got the Asperger's is still there at T6. T6 is down the bottom in the right-hand side.
Over here?
Underneath the ears. Show me, where's your cursor? No, go up. Go up to the top one, to theta in absolute power. Yeah, absolute power. and go down to the right-hand side of the brain, bottom right, where you've got that massive amount of red. Now go up.
Oh, up. Yep.
All the way.
Oh, here.
Yep. All right. So that's your central motor strip. So he's still restless. Go back to the other side on the same map. Just
Other
up
side.
here. No. Just on that map there. There it is.
Mm-hmm.
There. So we've still got the ADHD part to work on, but most of that frontal lobe is now back online, which was huge. Yep. So he went back home. He came back and did another couple of sessions, and he went overseas, recreated his life there, and I haven't heard from him since.
So here's the difference. Here's the first before TRTP, and here's after. And there's huge.
This was no neurofeedback. This was no dietary changes. This was no talk therapy. This was just TRTP. I had no time to do anything else because he had a certain amount of time that he was going to be down.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that, Rosemary. Right. And we are going to have Rosemary doing many of these EEGs to prove the process. In terms of, someone asked about the rage. You can turn off the rage if you turn off the videotape loops. The rage is a symptom of the trauma that's replaying in the subconscious as if it's happening now, it's happening now, it's happening now. That's why I'm so reactive. That's why I'm either in fight or flight of the hypoarousal or freeze of the hypoarousal. And so what the rage is a symptom. The not being able to think is not being able to regulate. The fear, everything is a danger. The whole being is screaming, I'm not safe. Yep. The OCD, the hoarding, the anxiety, the depression, the panic attacks, the weird phobias, it's all, you know, the DID, it's all a symptom of dreadfulness that's happened that has not been stored properly in the warehouse of memory and the door shut. And so the symptoms simply disappear when you turn off the videotape loops. So for example, I used to specialize in violent, angry men brought against their will. They're on their way, had been pulled off, some of them that morning, trying to strangle their ex-girlfriend. There was one who trying to strangle his ex-wife, had smashed every window in her house, every panel in her car, and broken her guitar over his head. And he was homicidal, suicidal. He was hell-bent on killing her, the new boyfriend, the children, and then killing himself. And after one session, admittedly it was a long session, everyone was safe. And that was in 2012, been following him since 2012, and his life just gets better and better. Where does, yeah, sure.
Up a little bit just to bring all the brain areas into,
you want to,
just a quick summary. Okay. Mm-hmm. For strategies to be successful with PTSD clients, you have to get that critical balance between those three brain networks we talked about. The default mode networks, the salience, and the executive control need to be addressed. And the connection between your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, the balance between the amygdala, the medial frontal cortex, we have to shift that, resulting in decreased activity in frontal regions to stop people literally taking leave of their senses. Because if you don't get them to integrate, to reintegrate, they do take leave of their senses. And there's two ways to manage this. And Judith, I'm just going to summarize quickly. Yep. We can regulate from the top down or from the bottom up. So the bottom up recalibrates the autonomic nervous system by breath, movement, touch, drama. The top down strengthens the capacity of the watchtower, that prefrontal, that medial cortex, to watch and to monitor your bodily sensations, hypnosis, mindfulness, yoga, neurofeedback, the Richard's trauma process. These are top down. And I guess what we have to remember is the challenge of treating trauma is not only dealing with the past, but to give your clients enough skills so that it improves the quality of their daily life experiences. Therefore, we need to bring back online those brain areas that deserted them when they were overwhelmed by trauma. And the Richard's trauma process, in my view, is a top-down approach to resetting brain areas that were hijacked by trauma without having clients repeatedly relive the process while placing them firmly in the present moment. And that's what I find is the power of TRTP. We're in the present moment and we give them back their power in the present without all the trauma of having to relive it, because you remember that neurons that fire together wire together. We don't want the trauma rewired anymore. We want them rooted firmly in the present, and that's what TRTP does for them.
And that's why we don't get people to tell their stories.
Never.
And so it's like a reboot. If anyone's ever done a factory reboot on their phone, it's a factory reset of the entire physiology. So it's more than just memory reprocessing, it shifts the physiology. And so people who had extreme gut problems all of a sudden don't. People who have chronic fatigue all of a sudden don't. So it's an interesting process. Thank you very much, Rosemary. That was fast and furious. We didn't get it all done, but we got a fair bit of it done. And there were a number of questions earlier on about the training. I'll just answer some of those, and I got some emails earlier today about it. So we have an 8-week training program. That the next one's in February. We are over prescribed. We are overbooked for September, October, which we start tomorrow. So it's all online now. So even the 3-day workshop that used to be face-to-face is all online. There's online learning, there's online Zoom calls similar to this. What we're doing isn't working. Can we just see that? And people are traumatized in the mental health system. And so we have to do something further. We have to do something that works. We have to do something that's quick, that doesn't take months and months. It doesn't take years and years and years. A lot of the mental health professionals who come to us say that they're on the edge of burnout. They go home exhausted. And what they report is that with doing TRTP, it's not just professionally transformative, but personally, and they go home exhilarated. In fact, it's addictive because you actually see people change very, very quickly if they engage in the process, and it doesn't matter what you're doing. If someone doesn't want to get well, there's nothing you can do. So if you are interested in finding out more about the training, what we're doing is, like with some of our graduate cohort, like with Rosemary, we are doing the research. We're partnering with Phoenix Institute. We're partnering with the medical department at Melbourne University in our research to prove the process. We are going to change how mental health is done on the planet. This is a revolutionary new process that's fast and effective. And so if you are interested in joining us on this journey, can you just type in interested? And you can, if you don't want to do it, and down the bottom, to all panelists, or you can do it to me. And we will be in touch with you tomorrow and early next week. You'll probably be getting a phone, well, you will be getting a phone call from lovely Louise with a capital LL, who looks after that side of inquiries for us. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Rosemary.
My pleasure.
Love your work, Rosemary, and I love it when we come together. I love our conversations together. So I hope that people here got something out of that. You will be getting a link to the recording. We have TRTP, which is Trauma Process channel on YouTube, where all our webinars are and interviews. So do yourself a favor, as Molly Meldrum would say, and go and have a look. Have a look at pseudo-stroke, trauma stroke. Have a look at addiction and trauma. Have a look at children and trauma. There's just so much information there with various TRTP graduates and what they're doing with TRTP. Thank you. And also pain, chronic pain and trauma. So on that note, we'll go. But interested, type in interested if you are wanting some further information, and come and help us change the world. Our small end point, as I said, is to change how trauma is treated, mental health is treated on the planet, because it's not working. I mean, just look at all those children presenting in emergency departments with suicide attempts and cutting. It's just horrendous. We have to do something different. Rosemary, I'll shut up now. I'll carry on. Thanks so much, and I will talk to you very soon. I'm lucky that I get to talk to Rosemary fairly often. Thank you to everybody who attended. And stay tuned. There will be more. Oh, the other thing is we're doing a workshop in October, a 3-hour workshop on how do you change the subconscious core beliefs that cause self-sabotage. So that's what we do in the first session. Because if the subconscious is saying it's not safe to be well, it's not safe to be well, and you're trying to help a person get well, hello, it's not going to happen. So in our first session of TRTP, we change that and get the subconscious and conscious in sync. So there's a 3-hour workshop on that coming up in October. Stay tuned. If you're on here on this webinar, you'll be on our email list and you'll soon have an email telling you when that will be. It will be a Saturday morning sometime in October.
Wonderful.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Put me down.
Okay.
Take
Sure.
care.
Thank you, everybody. We'll finish there. Have a good evening. Have a lovely day if it's daytime where you are. Thanks once again.
Thanks.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.